I've spent decades looking into the eyes of people who are hurting, people who are hiding, and people who are just plain lost. One thing I've learned is that secrets are like a cancer for the soul. They don't just sit there quietly in the corner of your mind. They grow, they metastasize, and eventually they demand to be fed. They require a constant maintenance of lies, a relentless partitioning of the heart that eventually tears a person apart from the inside out. I remember sitting in my dressing room, looking at a thin manila folder containing the life story of a man named David. On the surface, David was the quintessential success story, a high-level executive, a donor to his local church, a father of 3, and a husband of 22 years. But as I read the notes from my producers, I realized we weren't just dealing with a marriage in a slump. We were looking at a man who had built a literal house of cards, and the wind was starting to blow. When David first walked onto my stage, he didn't look like a villain. He didn't have a shifty gaze or a nervous tic. He looked tired. He had that particular kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying a weight you weren't meant to carry. He sat down in that chair across from me, adjusted his tie, and gave me a polite nod. He told me he was there because his marriage to Sarah was failing and he didn't know why. He talked about communication breakdowns and growing apart, using all the buzzwords people use when they want to describe a problem without actually touching the wound. But I could see it in his eyes. There was a wall there. And my job, the reason I do what I do, is to find the crack in that wall and start pulling it down. Because you can't fix what you don't acknowledge. You can't heal a wound that you're still trying to pretend isn't there. I looked at him and I didn't start with the hard questions. I wanted to see the man he thought he was. He talked about Sarah with a strange kind of clinical affection. He called her a wonderful mother and a stable partner. He spoke about their 3 children, 2 in college, 1 in high school, with a pride that seemed genuine but distant. He described his life as a series of obligations and achievements. He was a provider. He was a pillar of the community. But as he spoke, I kept thinking about the information my team had uncovered. You see, people come on this show thinking they can control the narrative. They think they can give me the sanitized version of their lives. But I've been doing this long enough to know that the truth doesn't live in the words people choose. It lives in the spaces between them. It lives in the things they refuse to say. I asked him, David, why are you really here? He gave me the same rehearsed answer about saving his marriage. I leaned in and I told him, David, I don't think you're here to save your marriage. I think you're here because you're exhausted from lying. I think you're here because the life you've built is a lie. And you're looking for someone to help you blow it up because you don't have the courage to do it yourself. The silence that followed was heavy. It was the kind of silence that has a physical weight to it. He didn't look away, but I saw his jaw tighten. He wasn't ready to break yet. He was still trying to maintain the persona. To understand how a man like David ends up in a chair across from me, you have to look back at how these things start. It's never one big decision. Nobody wakes up on a Tuesday and says, I think I'll start a second family today. It's a series of small, incremental betrayals of the self. It starts with a feeling of being unappreciated or a sense of loneliness in a crowded room. For David, it started 8 years ago on a business trip to Seattle. He met a woman named Elena. He told me much later that with Elena, he didn't have to be the provider or the pillar. He could just be David. It was a classic trap. He stepped into a fantasy world where there were no mortgage payments, no teenage rebellion, and no history of marital friction. It was a clean slate. He told Sarah he had to take more frequent trips for work. He created a separate email account. He got a second phone. At first, it was just an affair, a dirty little secret he thought he could manage. But then Elena got pregnant, and that is the moment where most men would have been forced to make a choice. They would have confessed, or they would have walked away. But David In his profound arrogance and his desperate need to be the good guy in every story, decided he could do both. He decided he could be a father and a husband in 2 different zip codes. He bought a small townhouse in Seattle. He told Sarah it was a corporate apartment to save the company money. He started split funding his life, funneling bonuses and side commissions into an account Sarah never saw. Think about the sheer psychological labor required to pull that off for 7 years. He had 2 sets of keys, 2 sets of holiday traditions. He had to remember which daughter was allergic to peanuts and which son wanted to be a pilot, while also remembering the milestones of a 5-year-old boy in Seattle who called him Daddy and only saw him every other week. He was living in a state of perpetual performance. When he was with Sarah, he was the bored, reliable husband. When he was with Elena, he was the devoted, long-distance father who worked crushing hours to provide for them. He wasn't living one life, he was living 2 half-lives, and as a result, he wasn't truly present in either of them. I asked him about the logistics of it, not because I cared about the money, but because I wanted him to hear the absurdity of his own life. I wanted him to realize that he had turned his existence into a cold, calculated operation. He described the system, he had the color-coded calendars, the scripts he wrote for himself so he wouldn't get his stories crossed. He spoke about it with a terrifying level of detachment. It was as if he were describing a logistics problem at his firm rather than the systematic emotional destruction of 2 families. I told him, David, you're not a secret agent. You're a man who is starving his soul to feed his ego. You think you're being noble by not leaving either of them, but the truth is you're being a coward. You're stealing their lives so you don't have to face the consequences of your own choices. The tension in his household with Sarah had escalated to a breaking point before they called us. She knew something was wrong. She wasn't stupid. She felt the distance. She saw the way he guarded his phone like it was a holy relic. She felt the coldness in their bed. She thought he was having a string of one-night stands, or maybe he was just depressed. She never in her wildest dreams imagined that her husband, the man she had built a life with, had a whole other child, a whole other kitchen table, a whole other woman who called herself his wife in every way. But on paper, Sarah was the one who reached out to the show, thinking I would help her reconnect with her husband. Little did she know, I was about to hand her a sledgehammer. As we sat there, I knew the confrontation phase of this process was going to be brutal. My producers had already arranged for Elena to be available via a remote feed, and Sarah was backstage waiting to come out for what she thought was a session on marital intimacy. David didn't know Elena was involved. He thought he was just here to talk about his stress and work-life balance. He was still playing the game. He was still trying to manage me. He kept leaning on his professional credentials, trying to establish a peer-to-peer relationship with me. He'd say things like, well, Phil, in my position, you understand the pressure. And I would just cut him off. I don't care about your position. I care about your character. And right now, David, your character is a bankrupt account. I looked at the monitor and then back at him. David, I said, my voice dropping an octave the way it does when I'm done playing around. The truth is going to come out today. It's either going to come out of your mouth or it's going to come out of mine. And believe me, you'd much rather it be you. Because once I start talking, the time for your explanation is over. You have 5 seconds to tell me the truth about Seattle. He froze. The blood drained from his face so fast it was like someone had pulled a plug. That polished executive exterior finally cracked. He looked at the cameras, then at me, and I saw a man who realized he had finally run out of road. He looked like he was about to vomit. The silence stretched, and for a second, I thought he might just stand up and walk off the stage. But he didn't. He slumped. His shoulders dropped 6 inches. He whispered, "How do you know about Seattle?" I looked at David, and for the first time since he sat down, I saw the real man, not the polished mask he'd spent 7 years perfecting. When he asked me how I knew about Seattle, he wasn't really asking for the source of my information. He was acknowledging that the game was over. The air in the studio felt different in that moment. It got thick, heavy with the weight of a truth that had been buried for far too long. I told him it didn't matter how I knew. What mattered was that the secret was no longer a secret. It was a reality that was about to collide with the life he had fought so hard to protect. I could see his mind racing, trying to find a way to spin this, to find a version of the truth that would make him look less like a betrayer and more like a victim of circumstance. But I wasn't going to let him do that. You see, a man like David lives in a world of internal logic. He's convinced himself that he's doing the right thing by keeping everyone happy, even if that happiness is built on a foundation of absolute deception. I had Sarah brought out then. She walked onto the stage with a look of profound confusion and a trace of fear. She had been in the back, hearing some of what we were saying, but not yet grasping the magnitude of it. When she sat down next to him, she reached for his hand out of habit, and I watched David flinch. That one movement told the whole story. He couldn't stand the touch of the woman he had been betraying for nearly a decade, not because he hated her, but because her touch was a reminder of his own cowardice. I looked at Sarah and I didn't sugarcoat it. I told her, "Sarah, your husband hasn't been working late in Seattle. He hasn't been staying in a corporate apartment. He's been living a second life. He has a second home, a woman named Elena, and a 5-year-old son." The sound she made wasn't a cry. It was a sharp, guttural gasp, like someone had punched her in the solar plexus and stolen the very oxygen from her lungs. She looked at David, waiting for him to laugh, waiting for him to tell her I was crazy, but David just looked at his shoes. That's the moment the world ends for a spouse, the moment the silence confirms the unthinkable. I let that silence sit there for a beat. I wanted David to feel the heat of her gaze. I wanted him to see the physical manifestation of the pain he had caused. Sarah started shaking, a fine, rhythmic tremor that took over her whole body. She kept repeating, "A son? A son?" It wasn't the affair that was breaking her. It was the permanence of it. An affair is a mistake. A second family is a choice made every single day for thousands of days in a row. I turned my attention back to David. I asked him, "How did you think this was going to end? Did you think you'd just keep this up until you were 80? Did you think you could just die and let them find out at the funeral?" He looked up then, and there were tears in his eyes, but they weren't for Sarah. They were for himself. He started talking about how he fell into it. He said he never meant to hurt anyone. He used the word love to describe his feelings for both women. I stopped him right there. I told him, "Don't you dare use the word love. Love is a verb, love is an action. What you've done is the opposite of love. Love is about transparency, it's about sacrifice, it's about being known. You haven't let either of these women know you. You've given them a fictional character to live with, and you've stolen their right to make their own choices about their lives." This is where the psychology gets deep. David wasn't a sociopath. If he were a sociopath, he wouldn't be crying. He was something more common and in some ways more dangerous. He was a man with a hero complex fueled by deep-seated insecurity. As we dug into his backstory, we found a childhood where he was the fixer for a mother who was emotionally unstable and a father who was largely absent. He learned early on that his value was tied to his ability to keep the peace and provide emotional stability for others. He grew up believing that if he stopped performing, if he showed any weakness or made any bad choices, he would be discarded. So when the situation in Seattle happened, his brain didn't process it as a moral failing to be corrected. It processed it as a new problem to be managed. He thought he was being a good man by not abandoning Elena and the baby, and he thought he was being a good husband by not breaking Sarah's heart with the truth. He had compartmentalized his life into two separate boxes, and he truly believed he could keep those boxes from ever touching. I looked at Sarah, who was now weeping silently, and I asked her what she was feeling. She looked at David and said, "I don't even know who you are. I look at you and I see a stranger. Did you ever love me? Or was I just the primary box on your list?" That's the question that haunts every betrayed spouse. They look back at 20 years of memories, the births of their children, the vacations, the quiet mornings, and they wonder if any of it was real. They wonder if the person they were sharing their bed with was actually there, or if they were just a hollow shell. I told Sarah that her pain was a rational response to an irrational situation. She wasn't crazy for not seeing it. He was a professional-grade liar. He had spent years studying her, knowing exactly what she needed to hear to stay settled, exactly how much attention to give her to keep her from asking too many questions. Then I brought the hammer down. I told him we were going to bring Elena into the conversation via a video link. David's head snapped up. "No," he pleaded. "Please don't do that." She doesn't know about the show. She thinks I'm at a conference. I looked him dead in the eye and said, "David, you've been the director of this play for 7 years. Today, I'm taking the baton." Elena deserves to know why her husband disappears for 2 weeks every month. She deserves to know that her son's father has another family that he's been lying to her about just as much as he's been lying to Sarah. When Elena's face appeared on the big screen, she looked confused. She was in her kitchen in Seattle, a bright, sunny room. You could see a child's drawings on the refrigerator behind her. She saw David on the screen, and her face lit up for a split second before she realized where he was and who was sitting next to him. The look on her face when she saw Sarah, the realization of who Sarah must be, was one of the most haunting things I've ever seen. It was the look of a person watching their entire reality disintegrate in real time. She didn't scream, she didn't cry, she just went pale and sat down, her hand over her mouth. "Elena," I said gently, "I'm Dr. Phil. You're on my stage with David and his wife of 22 years, Sarah." The word wife hit Elena like a physical blow. She looked at David and whispered, "You told me you were divorced. You told me the divorce was finalized years ago. You showed me the papers, David." David looked like he wanted to crawl into a hole and die. He had forged divorce papers. He had created an entire legal history that didn't exist. He hadn't just lied, he had committed fraud to maintain the illusion. I asked David, "How many more lies, David? How many more layers of this onion are we going to peel back before we get to something that isn't rotten?" The confrontation was no longer just about a marriage, it was about the total collapse of a man's identity. David sat there, trapped between the two women he had deceived, forced to confront the wreckage he had created. I pointed to the screen, to Elena's devastated face, and then to Sarah, who was sitting inches away from him, and I said, "Look at them, David. Look at what you've done. You claimed you stayed in both lives because you didn't want to hurt anyone. But look at them now. You haven't protected them. You've destroyed them both. You've given them a trauma that will take years, if not decades, to heal. And you did it all for you. You did it so you could feel like a big man, a man with 2 families, a man who could have it all without ever having to pay the bill." I saw a shift in David then. The defensiveness started to turn into a raw, ugly shame. He started to realize that there was no way out. There was no fix for this. He couldn't go back to Seattle, and he couldn't go back home to Sarah. He was a man without a country, a man whose lies had finally created a prison of his own making. I told him, "David, you're not a monster, but you've done monstrous things. And the only way you're ever going to have a shred of integrity again is if you stop talking, stop explaining, and start listening to the pain you've caused. You need to sit in this fire. You need to feel every bit of it, because this is the price of the life you chose to live. The audience was dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Usually there's a lot of murmuring, a lot of judgment, but this was so heavy, so tragic, that people were just stunned. It wasn't just about the betrayal, it was about the sheer scale of the deception. It was about how one man's ego can blind him to the humanity of the people he claims to love. I looked at the three of them, Sarah on the stage, Elena on the screen, and David in the middle, and I realized we were looking at a triple car pileup where no one was going to walk away uninjured. The look on Sarah's face when she looked at Elena wasn't one of anger, at least not initially. It was a look of recognition. It was as if she was seeing a mirror image of her own shattered heart. And Elena, looking back through a computer screen thousands of miles away, didn't see a rival. She saw the woman who had been living the life she thought she was working toward. I've seen this happen before, when the other woman isn't a gold digger or a homewrecker, but another victim of a master manipulator. They were both grieving the same man, a man who didn't actually exist. I told them both, you two are the only ones in the world who truly understand what the other is going through right now. You've both been in love with a ghost. You've both built your futures on a foundation of sand. David tried to speak, tried to offer some kind of apology, but the words were hollow. He said, Sarah, Elena, I never wanted to choose. I loved you both so much I couldn't bear to lose either of you. I didn't let that slide. I leaned forward and said, David, that's a lie you tell yourself so you can sleep at night. You didn't stay because you loved them. You stayed because you were addicted to the way they made you feel. With Sarah, you were the established, successful patriarch. With Elena, you were the young, virile hero starting a new legacy. You weren't choosing them. You were choosing different versions of yourself. This wasn't about their needs. It was about your bottomless pit of a need for validation. You're an ego glutton, David. You ate your fill at two different tables while they both starved for the truth. I turned to Sarah and asked her about the kids. Sarah, your children are 19, 21, and 23. They're adults. They've been watching this communication breakdown for years. What do you think this is going to do to them when they find out their father has a 5-year-old brother in Seattle? Sarah put her head in her hands and just sobbed. She talked about how her son had always looked up to David, how he wanted to go into the same business. She talked about the family values David had preached at the dinner table. This is the collateral damage that people like David never account for. They think they're keeping the secret to protect the kids, but kids aren't stupid. They feel the tension. They sense the duplicity. They grow up learning that love is something that can be faked and that truth is optional. Then I asked Elena about her son. She started talking about how the boy would sit by the window waiting for Daddy to come home from his business trips. She talked about how David would bring him toys and tell him stories about being a world traveler. As she spoke, I could see David physically shrinking. The weight of the innocent child he had brought into this mess was finally starting to press down on him. I told him, David, that little boy in Seattle is going to grow up and ask why his father wasn't there for his school plays, why his father had another family he never mentioned. You haven't just lied to these women. You've robbed 3 grown children and 1 small boy of a father they could actually trust. You've given them a legacy of shame. We spent a long time in that session digging into the how. I wanted the audience, and more importantly, I wanted Sarah and Elena to understand the mechanics of the deception. David explained how he had 2 different bank accounts, how he used a consulting firm, shell company he created to funnel money to Seattle so it wouldn't show up on their joint tax returns. He had an assistant, someone he had since fired, who knew a little bit and helped him manage the travel. It was a calculated, cold-blooded operation. I asked him, did you ever feel guilty when you were tucked into bed with Sarah? Did you think about Elena? When you were playing with your son in Seattle, did you think about your daughters back home? He admitted that at first, the guilt was overwhelming. He said he'd have panic attacks in airport bathrooms, but then, he said, he just turned it off. He described it like a mental switch. He'd get on the plane, and by the time he landed, he was a different person. That is the definition of pathological compartmentalization. It's a survival mechanism that allows a person to function while committing acts that are completely at odds with their supposed values. I told him, David, you didn't turn off the guilt. You just buried it alive. And when you bury something alive, it doesn't stay dead. It rots. And that rot has been leaking into your marriage, into your parenting, and into your soul for 7 years. That's why you look like you're 100 years old today. The rot has finally reached the surface. Sarah finally looked at him and asked the question that had been burning in her mind since the moment she sat down. Was any of it real, David? The last 7 years, was there a single moment where you were actually there with me, or were you just checking a box until you could get back to your other life? David started to give her a yes, of course answer, but I stopped him. I told him, if you tell her one more lie, I'm going to end this right now. Give her the respect of the truth, even if it kills you. David stayed silent for a long time. Finally, he said, I don't know, Sarah. I was so busy keeping the story straight that I don't think I knew who I was anymore. I was just a performer. I was performing for you, and I was performing for her. That was the breakthrough moment. But it wasn't the kind of breakthrough people hope for. It wasn't a moment of healing. It was a moment of total annihilation. It was the admission that the man Sarah had been married to for 22 years had effectively ceased to exist 7 years ago. He had become a hollowed-out version of himself, a series of scripted responses and carefully timed gestures. Elena, hearing this on the screen, just closed her eyes. I could see her processing the fact that the hero who had rescued her from a lonely life was just a man playing a part. She realized she wasn't a partner, she was a prop in his second act fantasy. I took a breath and looked at the two women. I told them, you both have a choice to make today. And for the first time in a long time, that choice has nothing to do with David. He has had all the power for 7 years. He has controlled the information, he has controlled the narrative, and he has controlled your lives. Today, that power is gone. He is just a man sitting in a chair, caught in a trap of his own making. You don't have to fix him. You don't have to forgive him right now. You don't even have to talk to him. Your only job today is to decide what is best for you and your children, because he has proven that he is incapable of looking out for anyone but himself. I asked Elena what she wanted to do. She said, through tears, that she wanted him to never contact her again unless it was through a lawyer for child support. She said she couldn't look at him without seeing the lie. She looked at Sarah and said, I am so sorry. I didn't know. I swear to God, I didn't know. Sarah nodded, a tiny, fragile movement. I know, she whispered. He's very good at it. That moment of solidarity between the two women was the only piece of grace in that entire room. They were victims of the same con artist, and in that moment, they chose to see each other's humanity rather than their own perceived rivalry. David tried one last time to plead for understanding. He talked about his intentions. I told him, David, we judge ourselves by our intentions, but the world judges us by our actions. Your intentions are irrelevant. You can intend to be a good man all you want, but if you spend 7 years building a life on a foundation of lies and betrayal, then you are a liar and a betrayer. That is your identity now. You have to own that. You have to stop being the misunderstood hero and start being the man who blew up 2 families because he was too weak to be honest. The confrontation phase was winding down, but the air was still thick with the aftermath. I knew we needed to move towards some kind of resolution, even if that resolution was just a clean break. I looked at David and said, "You're going to leave this stage today, and you're going to find that the world you knew is gone. Your kids are going to have questions you can't answer. Your wife is likely going to leave you. Your second family is already gone. You've achieved the one thing you were most afraid of. You are finally alone. The question is, what are you going to do with that? Are you going to keep lying to yourself, or are you going to finally look in the mirror and face the man you've become?" I stood up and walked over to Sarah. I put a hand on her shoulder. I told her we were going to get her the best professional help possible. I told her that she wasn't alone and that the shame wasn't hers to carry. It belonged to the man sitting next to her. She looked up at me, and for the first time that day, I saw a spark of something other than pain. It was a spark of resolve. She looked at David, took off her wedding ring, and placed it on the small table between their chairs. She didn't say a word. She just got up and walked off the stage. When the cameras stopped rolling and the studio lights dimmed, the silence that took over was different from the silence during the taping. It wasn't the silence of anticipation, it was the silence of a tomb. David didn't move for a long time. He stayed in that chair, staring at the spot where Sarah had been sitting just moments before. He looked like a man who had been in a high-speed collision and was just now realizing he was missing limbs. I stayed with him for a few minutes. I don't believe in just dropping a bomb on someone's life and walking away to get a cup of coffee. I leaned in and told him, "David, the world you knew is over. You can't go back to yesterday. You spent 7 years playing a game you were always destined to lose. Now, you're standing in the wreckage. The question is, are you going to stay in the ruins, or are you going to start the long, painful work of becoming an honest man?" He didn't answer. He couldn't. The fixer in him was finally broken. I walked backstage to check on Sarah. She was in a private room with one of our counselors. She wasn't hysterical anymore, she was cold. That's the stage of grief that often scares people the most, the numbness. She told me she felt like she had been living in a movie and the film had suddenly snapped. She kept asking about the logistics. How would they tell the kids? How would they divide the house? How could she ever trust her own memory again? I told her that for now, she didn't need to have the answers. She just needed to breathe. I told her that she was finally free of the lie, even if the truth felt like a prison right now. She looked at me and said, "I'd rather be hurt by the truth than comforted by a lie, Phil." I just wish the truth didn't taste like ash. In the weeks following the show, the escalation of the fallout was as predictable as it was tragic. Sarah didn't go back to the house they shared. She stayed with her sister and filed for divorce within 48 hours. The 3 adult children were devastated. Their father, the man they thought was their moral compass, had become a stranger to them. One of his daughters told our producers she felt like her entire childhood had been a marketing brochure for a man she never really knew. David tried to reach out to them, sending long, rambling emails filled with the same kind of internal logic and self-justification he had used on my stage. They didn't respond. You see, when you spend a lifetime building a reputation on a lie, once that lie is exposed, the reputation doesn't just tarnish, it evaporates. In Seattle, Elena was dealing with her own version of hell. She had to explain to a 5-year-old boy why his father wasn't coming home for his birthday and why the man he called daddy was actually a man with a completely different life thousands of miles away. She filed for full custody and a child support arrangement that was as aggressive as the law allowed. She didn't want his love anymore. She wanted his accountability. She told me in a follow-up call that she felt like she had been an accidental accomplice in a crime she didn't know was being committed. She struggled with the guilt of having taken a man away from his family, even though she had no idea that family existed. I told her the same thing I told Sarah. The shame belongs to the liar, not the person who believed the lie. As for David, his professional life began to crumble as well. In the executive world, your word is your bond, and word of his double life spread quickly. People began to wonder if he could deceive his own wife and children for 7 years, what was he doing with the company's books? What was he doing with the contracts? He was asked to resign within a month of the episode airing. He lost the hero status he had worked so hard to maintain. He ended up moving into a small apartment, the kind of place a man lives when he's starting over from scratch in his 50s. He was finally living the life he had feared most, one where there were no scripts, no fans, and no one to provide for but himself. I checked in on him about 6 months later. He had started intensive therapy, the kind that forces you to go back to the very beginning and look at the why behind the what. He was beginning to realize that his need to be everything to everyone was actually a form of extreme selfishness. He was learning that by trying to avoid giving anyone pain, he had inflicted the maximum amount of it. He told me he spent a lot of time walking in a park near his apartment, just watching families play and wondering if he would ever be part of one again. He was beginning to understand that forgiveness isn't something you're entitled to, it's something you have to earn. And even then, it's not guaranteed. The outcome of this story isn't a neat, happy ending. There are no "where are they now" photos of everyone smiling at a graduation together. That's not how real life works when the betrayal is this deep. Sarah is rebuilding her life, rediscovering who she is when she's not the wife of a pillar of the community. She's found a strength she didn't know she had. Elena is focused on being a single mother, making sure her son knows he is loved, even if his father is a flawed, distant figure. The children are slowly, painfully figuring out how to have a relationship with their father that is based on reality rather than the hero image he projected. I reflect on David often when I talk about the cost of secrets. He thought he was a high-stakes gambler who could keep all the plates spinning forever. But life has a way of balancing the books. You can't live 2 lives and expect to keep your soul intact. Eventually, the weight of the deception becomes too much for the architecture of a human life to bear. David's story is a cautionary tale for anyone who thinks they can manage a lie. You don't manage a lie. The lie manages you. It dictates where you go, what you say, and who you are allowed to be. It turns you into a prisoner in a jail you built yourself. I've learned that the most important relationship you will ever have is the one you have with yourself. If you can't look in the mirror and know that you are a man of integrity, then no amount of money, no amount of professional success, and no amount of secret families will ever make you feel whole. David is finally looking in that mirror. The man looking back at him is older, sadder, and lonelier, but for the first time in 7 years, that man is real. And in my book, being real, no matter how painful it is the only way to truly live. You have to be willing to stand in your own truth, even if that truth is a second family that you never planned to say out loud. Because until you say it out loud, you're just a ghost haunting your own life. The journey toward healing for everyone involved is going to take years. It's a marathon, not a sprint. But the first step was taken on that stage, in that chair, when the secret finally ran out of places to hide. I hope that by telling this story, someone out there who is carrying their own Seattle realizes that the truth doesn't just set you free, it gives you your life back. It might be a life that looks nothing like the one you have now, and it might be a life filled with consequences you dread, but it will be a life you can actually live, and at the end of the day, that's all any of us can ask for. We have to be the authors of our own stories, and we have to make sure those stories are written in the ink of truth. Anything else is just fiction, and fiction never stands up to the reality of the human heart.